right. Our first speaker today is Dr. Christy Petersen, who's a veterinarian and professor at the University of Iowa. She's with the Center for Infectious Diseases. There you are. Dr. Petersen has worked with the Master of Foxhounds and thousands of hounds over the last 15 years. She is the U.S. representative to the International Veterinary Group that provides recommendations regarding treatment and prevention of infection with the parasite. I'm terrible at these words. I will just tell you that right now. Leishmania. All right. I know it's easy, but I'm on pain meds. Dr. Petersen's collaborative group focuses on understanding how and why diseases spread between animals and to people, a concept called One Health. She is also a professor at University of Iowa and teaches coursework related to the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of infectious diseases with all creatures, great and small, including people. And today she's going to be presenting on unwanted stowaways, screening imported animals for disease, introduction, and spread within the U.S. Please welcome Dr. Christy Petersen.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. And it sounds like, despite being kickoff, you guys are wide awake and rowdy already. I love it. So I was asked to talk about the diseases that particularly dogs might have, but things to think about with importation and what the challenges are. And this is going to be kind of a trifecta of talks then. The next one given by Dr. Petersen from the CDC, virtually, and then to hear a little bit about some proposed legislation that might help with that. So as it was stated in the bio, I have gotten to hang out with and participate in research with various hounds for the last almost 20 years. But that also means that my children, much like this organization where the whole family pitches in, also get roped in, and that's what's happening in this photo is my son is spending a spring break wrestling hound puppies. So just to kind of set the stage of what sort of diseases are we thinking about here, always the first one that comes to everybody's mind is rabies. And thankfully we've already had good rules and legislation, and are they perfect? No. But they're useful, and it has really made a big difference in rabies in the United States. Dog rabies does not occur. It's been eliminated. And you guys are probably thinking to yourselves, well, there's still rabies that happens in the United States. It's other types, so it comes from bats or raccoons or skunks or other animals. The other big one on every breeder's mind, of course, is brucella. And brucella continues to be a problem. I actually got an email yesterday from a pet owner in Wisconsin whose dog had just been diagnosed, trying to figure out what do they do. Do we have to euthanize? And then the fun one that's the tongue twister, I pronounce it leishmaniasis or leishmania because the gentleman who first discovered it was Dr. Leishman, and that's where it comes from, a Scotsman. And there are other species. That's why, you've got Leishmania infantum and then tropica and the other SPP, that's species. And then pseudorabies virus, I'll not talk about today, but if somebody wants to hear more about it, I'm happy to talk about it. It has been eliminated from the United States in our production hog population, but it's still a big problem, and if you get hounds to hunt feral pigs, they will get pseudorabies, and it's a big issue. And then there's lots of other things. I can list off other fun things we really don't want here. But the idea was just to get you thinking about the fact that we all come with foreign objects in our bodies, and there's ones that are fine for us to travel with, and there's ones that we really don't want to. So moving first to brucella. Brucella is a bacterial disease, and it comes from a wide family of diseases, and they have many different species for many different types of animals. Interestingly, the dog version, or Brucella canis, now has several species that have stemmed off of it that are among the pinnipeds, which are animals with flippers, mammals with flippers specifically. And the thought had been for a long time that Brucella canis isn't as bad as some of the other species in terms of causing diseases in people. Specifically when you talk about Brucella suis or melitensis, and you're probably looking at me like, she's just saying these words, what does this mean? So on the rest of the planet, Brucella is a big problem in animals that give milk to people or meat. And it's often during the slaughtering process that people become infected. We don't generally have that problem, thank goodness, because a lot of the United States thinks that our meat comes packaged in little plastic wrapper, and the interaction with that is limited for most people. So Brucella, therefore, is not something we're thinking about, except if you are helping dogs whelp, because honestly, that is where the big interaction can happen. Aborted material from a dog can contain 10 to the 10th bacteria, which is a number that's even hard to comprehend. But the whole thing is you don't want this to get into your breeding. And to talk about it a little bit more, generally when I hear about it, and I live in Iowa, so given that bias, it's a small breed dog that I'm being called about that's come from somewhere in the central United States, often a larger breeding production, and that's me being polite. Usually they've been screened by a test called RSAT, and RSAT is very likely to pick up a positive, but can give you false positives. And that's the first question I'm going to ask is, has the test been confirmed? But the other things you need to think about is this is reportable in 28 different states. It does cause disease in people. So there was a young kid who interacted with a dog that was infected that did end up getting systemic disease. It, in people, leads to undulating fevers, and very large lymph nodes can cause reproductive problems in people as well, but it's just as likely to lead to ocular problems or problems elsewhere in the body. So it's just not something you really want to mess with, and unfortunately, most MDs aren't going to think about this as the first, second, or even 30th thing. So it's something that I'm talking to you about so that if you do get a fever that isn't going away, you can tell your doc, I work with dogs, or I work with a different species, because those zoonoses, those diseases that go between animals and people, are something that they receive a grand total of about 2 weeks of instruction on. I kid you not. So this trace back, when you figure out where the dog got the brucella, will take you to that larger breeding production, and they are not in it for the good of the breed. Somebody was talking to me about Max Rothschild last night. They aren't thinking 20 years out, they aren't thinking 10 years out, they're thinking, I want to make money this year, and they often then opt to kill or cull their production and start again elsewhere. So what dogs are particularly at risk? Well, it is predominantly in purebred dogs because it's really in the breeding that it's spread. And here we've got a dog that's showing those ocular signs. You can see that really kind of cloudy eye in the dog. We are finding more and more that international trading is being related to some of these outbreaks too. And I heard from my good source that Southeast Asia is the latest flavor of where we seem to be getting brucella from. But there are reports in the literature of outbreaks from Sweden, Hungary, Colombia in South America, and of course the ones that I was talking about in the United States. It's funny, as you start working with breeders and different diseases, we want there to be this magic bloodline that is not susceptible, right? That you can breed to and then everybody will be fine. I have no evidence that that exists for brucella or for leishmania, I'll tell you right now. And here's the kicker with brucella. If the dog has it, you are never going to get out of that dog. It is lifelong infection. There is no way to get sterile cure. And because this is something that can be spread to people, it's taken very, very seriously by your state vet. And that's why they're going to tell you you probably should kill your dog. So this was a study that was published in the CDC's journal called Emerging Infectious Diseases now 4 years ago, or 2 minus the COVID blur, depending on how you count. And what you'll see is that, they've got, all right, so there's the dots, the different colored dots. The yellow dots are a seroprevalence of 0 to 6. So that means if you test the blood of dogs, that's how many in percentage will be infected. And you'll see that United States is either yellow or orange. So the highest that we've gotten in this country is about 20%, which is a lot. That's a fifth of the kennel, right? Or the fifth of the group that was tested. And as I was mentioning to you, that clusters in the Midwest, kind of Mid-South United States. But then look at, the coast of Brazil, and that's where I head to tomorrow. Not for brucella, for other purposes, but, so if you're thinking of bringing in a bloodline of Canacorsos, for instance, testing for brucella is really smart to do. And then you'll see, as we talked about, Southeast Asia, we've got some pretty dark red spots over there too. What does it do? Again, abortion is probably the worst thing. 1, because you lose that whole litter, but 2, that is very infectious material. And those pups that come out of a birth, if they are alive, they can be shedding bacteria for 2 to 3 months. And that's actually how this kid in 2012 got infected. You can imagine, 3 months old, this pup has now gone into a house with a small kid, and they're sleeping with it. They're having it kiss its face. They're, interacting with this puppy a lot. So this is where we're at highest risk. It's kids that don't have great immunity and those puppies that also don't have great immunity. Just a little bit about what happens in your adult or breeding animals. The males can get a prostatitis or epididymitis. So that means that the scrotum and the testicle can be enlarged. And similarly, the uterus can be inflamed in the bitch. Both signs that, can be visibly obvious. And then you can also get sperm abnormalities, so it makes it so that your stud dogs are not going to breed as well. And I stated this on the slide, but many of these slides come from a good friend and theriogenologist, Dr. Lynn Kaufman. So this was the case that happened in Serbia and then Poland and was published. So we started with an infected dog from Poland. That's the arrow that's coming in from the right-hand side, and I wish I could point to it, but I can't. I can't apparently use the pointer. So then we go to that red circle. That's a female dog. She's then bred to a male from Serbia, and 3 of her litters had multiple infected dogs that led to human infections. This dog that she bred to, the stud dog, led to 6 more sites, and this led to a huge traceback across the EU then. Similarly, I was brought into a case of over 30 dogs that were infected that all went back to one big kennel in Tennessee, and it led to, I think, something like 8 different kennels that chose to cull all their dogs. So just things to think about. And sorry, I'm the kickoff and fun and exciting, and here I am telling you all these terrifying, horrible things. I am going to get to things to do, but brucella is a tough one. So this is here in the United States, but it's really kind of re-emerging with new sources. Like I said, it looks like Southeast Asia is a potential site for that. The things you want to look for: abortion, epididymitis. So it's good to screen any dog that's coming in and make sure it's negative, or any dog you're going to breed to. It's going to remain an unrecognized threat unless there's some sort of international control. And having mandatory testing of any intact or breeding dog before they move, particularly internationally, but even interstate, is something that I think should be considered. And this is what that Emerging Infectious Disease article also called for from the CDC. So my slides have been given to Patty. She has them as a PDF. These are just some good resources, should, God forbid, you have to think about brucella. I have been told that we're going to do the talk after mine, and then we're going to take questions. But know that I'm happy to talk about any of this at any point throughout the meeting. So the next crazy, weird thing I'm talking about is leishmaniasis. It's another globally distributed disease. This one's a parasite, so it's a unicellular organism that is genetically slightly more similar to us. And again, you're like, what is this lady talking about and why do I care? Well, we care about that in this instance because it means that the drugs that we can make that fight this are more likely to make us sick because of that slightly closer relationship. It means that their metabolism is slightly more like us. So one of the drugs is a fungal drug called amphotericin B, and we call it amphoterrible because it's just as likely to cause renal failure as the disease is. So that's just something I'm giving you a heads up about. So as you're seeing on this World Health Organization map, this is found in something like 90 countries around the world, but I hope you notice that dark red brick color. There are 5 countries that have over 90% of the human cases, and that's India, Sudan, South Sudan, and Brazil. And it's not the people living in the lovely high-rises on the coast who are getting this disease. It's people who are living in pretty abject poverty. So there are lots of additional things that are leading to susceptibility of this disease. And this is something I'm asked all the time. You're going to find out, there are dogs in the United States who have this, and that's the hunting hounds that I've been working with for so long. So why aren't we getting it? Why don't the huntsmen get it? Well, we are well fed. We generally don't go tromping around the woods, huntsmen aside. And we have decent health care compared to most people living in favelas. I know there's tons of exceptions to that. And I respect them. But that's overall the big reason is, most of us don't have body condition scores of 2 or less. And those are the people and the dogs that I see really sick with this. So I know I've got some Oklahomas in the audience, and the next point is the first big outbreak of this that was reported in hounds was found in Oklahoma in 1980. And that was traced back, and they really didn't find a reason for it. But the whole litter was affected. After that, in 1999-2000, there was an outbreak, starting with a kennel in New York, and the CDC then looked at all of the different foxhound hunts across the country, testing 13,000 dogs, and found that about 10% of them across the board were infected. It's been fun to talk to a couple of people last night and this morning. So the big rule out for this in the United States is another crazy named disease called Chagas disease. They are cousins and they will cross-react serologically. And in the south of the United States, we do have Chagas disease. So it's just something to remember when you're thinking about them. So because of these outbreaks, that's how I got involved with the Masters of Foxhounds Association and looking at foxhounds in general. And we have worked with that group for the last decade and a half, helping them understand how the disease is spread. It's spread from mom to pup across the placenta in the United States, and since have proved that this actually happens globally to humans and to dogs. It's not something specific to the parasite that we have. It's not something specific to foxhounds. And if you start looking more closely, even in endemic locations, there is mom to pup transmission occurring as well as vector. And because of this relationship we've had and the work we've done, the CDC, their mandate is human health. The USDA is what's supposed to take care of everything else. Well, the USDA only has so much time and energy, so they do focus on food animal, and dogs kind of slip between the cracks. So when the CDC gets called about dog cases, they refer them to us. And because of that, we get a call about once every 2 weeks about a case of leishmaniasis, usually imported. So this is a little blow up of the World Health Organization map of places that are endemic for leishmaniasis. About 20% of dogs, for instance, in Rome will come up positive for this disease. And that's usually not something a breeder knows. So if they have a bloodline they're really excited about coming from Spain or south of France, or and I'm saying these places because there's been case reports of 2 boxers from Spain in the last 2 years, and I know that in both Bassets and Beagles, their disease comes from French bloodlines. So it's great to bring in new bloodlines from fun places and have those collaborators, because they live in a place where everybody knows about these things. They don't talk about it, and they're not going to necessarily warn you about it. So it's just good to ask, is there something I should ask you to test for? So any good card-carrying parasitologist, people who study parasites, we can't give a talk without showing you a life cycle. So here's my life cycle. The fun thing about this life cycle, again, sick, warped fun, because I study parasites, is it includes the dog. So usually if you go to the CDC website, they're just going to give you the person and the sandfly. But the dog really is the host that can keep it in our environment. Sandflies, this little fuzzy guy in the middle, that's a sandfly. They literally have hairy wings compared to mosquitoes, and they don't fly well. They only fly about 10 to 15 meters, or yards, pick your measure. And that means that a local insecticide can really do good things against it. But the dogs in your house, around your house, are the ones that can give it to you, your kids. And that's what we're finding in places like Brazil. So what do I see as the common cases? I've already given you kind of some hints, but this was like the flavor du jour over pre-COVID over the last couple of years. Golden retrievers. So a golden retriever breeder sources a fantastic breeding stud from an endemic country. And like I said, Spain has been one I've heard about a lot, and just did a huge outbreak investigation helping across Iowa, Wisconsin, and the dog, I'm sure, is lovely. The dog is fantastic. He's a proven breeder. He's about 3 years old, but it turns out he also has asymptomatic leishmaniasis. So you have no idea when you see him that he's got this problem. In the next 2 years, as you're breeding him, he starts getting skin disease. He starts getting crusty ears. He starts losing some weight. The vet, again, will first look at this dog and worry it has lymphoma, because you get really big lymph nodes from this. It travels in those white blood cells. They'll finally take a fine needle aspirate into that lymph node, and they'll see parasites, and that's where they start thinking leish. And usually by the time, good breeding dog a couple years in gets diagnosed, you've got 100+ puppies on the ground. So that's a big trace back. And it's a big reputational problem, right? Calling all those people, letting them know your dog has a disease that can spread to your kids and can be fatal. So what happens then? Well, usually in order to get this diagnosis, the dog has gone to pick your state, university, vet school. So often the first call to me is from that vet. Sometimes it's from the referring vet. Sometimes it's from the state veterinarian who has had it reported to them. Sometimes it's all three within the same day, all very panicked. And the first thing you have to do is reassure that, thankfully, as I've already told you guys, because of the lives we lead, we are less likely to be susceptible to this. If you are an adult American, the chances that you are going to get this is very low. But the person who has cancer and is on chemotherapy, the person who has another immunocompromise, the person who, for whatever reason, had a motorcycle accident and only has one kidney now, those are the people that I worry about. And these are ones I've heard, I know of, they'd happen. And the big problem with immunocompromise is, it's not like you walk around with a big sign on your forehead saying, hey, I'm immunocompromised, you need to take care of me. So it's important as vets to get good histories of, are you worried about anybody or yourself? Testing can be done through IDEX, can be done through several different state vet labs, and we do testing as well. We do testing mainly for research purposes and on the backs of graduate students, which means we do it cheaply. It also means I'm not going to give you a week turnaround, because if it's finals week, I'm not going to tell my kids that they're going to fail their finals to do the tests. And that's something I warn everybody about. Like, if you work with us, you will save money, but it will take more time. And if you want it tomorrow, go to IDEX. So how do dogs get this disease? I already told you, in most of the places where it's endemic, it's going through that little sandfly, and that's what the little blue arrow up at the top is. Breeding is the big one that I'm hoping to draw to your attention. We have found that if a mother dog, if a bitch has the disease, within a kennel, within a population, her puppies are 11 times more likely to come up with signs of it in their lifetime than any other puppy. We have seen evidence that a dog can give it to a bitch and then the bitch can pass it on. That's less well proven, but there was this one awful case of an Afghanistan, of a US military personnel who went to Afghanistan getting leishmaniasis, bringing it home, giving it to his wife and his child. So we do know that this happens in people too. As I told you, this is in blood, this is in white blood cells, so blood donations can do it. For a while, foxhounds were one of the best sources of blood for for donors to give to other dogs who were sick. Anytime I hear about that, I quickly remind them that's a terrible idea and please stop. But just something to remember, if you have a dog who's coming from an endemic place for lice, you really don't want that in your blood supply. And unfortunately, there are now published reports within households of a not-so-friendly dog attacking a sick friend in the household and passing lice that way. So fighting can do it, fighting, biting. This is what lice looks like. This hound was named Royal. You can see he's got conjunctivitis in his eye. There are changes that happen in the eyes that lead to dry eye and conjunctivitis. Normally you wouldn't be able to see the spots under their white part of their coat, so he's got hair loss, alopecia, and often the skin will get flaky. If you look really carefully, you might believe me that under that, his left ear, you can kind of see a bump. Again, you can tell me I'm nuts, but their lymph nodes get giant. And, I bring vet students out, and that's how they're like, oh my gosh, those are lymph nodes. And I'm like, yeah, those are lymph nodes. And that's why it's confused as lymphoma. Then the other signs as the dog gets more sick lead to renal failure, and they will have parasites throughout their body. And proving this and showing that this is very similar to what happens in the rest of the world was done by two fantastic, at the time, vet path residents, Catherine Gibson Corley and Kevin Esch, shown here. So I feel like I've kind of emphasized this enough already, but why do we care? Why is this a big deal? Well, even though we know we've got some dogs in the United States already who have this disease, so that's the hounds I've told you about, but also I've worked with the Neapolitan Mastiff population, Briards, Corsicas. Pretty much think about that map I showed you and think about what breeds come from there. If we've brought those dogs from an endemic place, 20% of them probably have lice, and we have bred them in the United States. They are here. Again, so these two kiddos are obviously not from the United States, but these are what people who have lice look like. So you get that very distended abdomen, one, because they're malnourished, but two, because their spleen and their liver are taking up most of the top half of their abdomen. And that's why it's called visceral leishmaniasis. And that's what can happen to an immunocompromised person. And unfortunately, because this is a neglected tropical disease, An MD is going to take a long time to think about this and diagnose it. So each state has addressed this in different ways, and that's why I'm usually getting phone calls from the state vets, because they don't know what to do. So one of the things we're working on is to try to make that clearer. It is reportable to the USDA, but as I've already mentioned, the USDA has to take care of every other animal aside from people. So where do they focus their efforts? Our food supply. Avian influenza is taking up a lot of their time right now. And before avian influenza, there was African swine fever, and there's always something that's really taking up their time and efforts. So the 6 people, and I think that's a real number, 6 people for the USDA who are doing companion animals for the US, inspecting all the kennels, trying to keep track of infectious diseases. So we need to help that. So what should we do? Well, as I told you, I'm working with the CDC, Dr. Ann Straley particularly, and all those letters are just saying she's in the Division of Parasitic Diseases, so the people who think about these things. And I haven't talked much about this, but as you might imagine, our military working dogs are at high risk for the places they go. The Middle East is endemic for this, Southern Europe, and other locations. So the DoD is pretty interested in coming up with what we should do too. Between those groups, we are trying to assess state by state what the approaches are and what best practices are. Emily, who you're going to hear from next, has already been in conversations with Dr. Straley to really think about what we want to do as a nation for this disease. But we need to establish how to prevent importation. Just because even though we already have some in the United States, we really don't want more infected dogs because, like it or not, we are seeing sandflies that have been in Mexico in places like Texas and Oklahoma, leading to cutaneous forms of this disease. And that can move in other places and spread. And like I said, for us, the big concern is companion animal health really falls between food animal, human, and then we've got, wildlife kind of taken up somewhat by fish and game folks. We need better infrastructure to protect our companion animals against infectious diseases. So again, some resources for this. Just some reminders for you, especially as it's getting warmer. Topical insecticides work really well against fleas, ticks, and it will prevent spread via sandflies of leishmaniasis and heartworm prevention. Both brucella and leishmania are problems globally that can be imported and bred into your lines. Dogs get sick from leishmania usually after co-infection from something like a tick-borne disease or other immune stress, and breeding is a stress. I don't know if any of you have kids, but I can vouch for that. And then in Southern Europe and Brazil, there are vaccines to help prevent the spread. We do not have the vaccine in the United States because to date there has not been the commercial need for it. And that's despite long conversations. And then, remember for you to do tick checks, use insecticides when you need them, and protect your animals. Thank you so much for listening to the horrifying kickoff of the meeting. But know that there are things we can do against this. There are steps that we can take that are pretty clear, and are working hard to try to make them happen.